Good evening, everyone. I wish I could see you, but I cannot. It's nice to have you all here this evening. And welcome to the Filson Historical Society's Gertrude Polk Brown Lecture. I'm Angela Edwards, and I am chair of the board of the Filson Historical Society, and we're delighted to have you here this evening. Tonight, we are so honored to be welcoming Clay Risen to discuss his latest work, Red Scare, McCarthyism and the Making of Modern America. Clay is no stranger to the Ohio Valley with his numerous publications chronicling the bourbon industry. He is also the author of several U.S. history books, including The Crowded Hour, Theodore Roosevelt, The Rough Riders, and the Dawn of the American Century. Clay is a founding managing editor of Democracy, a journal of ideas, and an assistant editor at the New Republic. He's making devices. And with that, please join me with a warm Filson Historical Society welcome for the president and CEO of the Filson, Dr. Patrick Lewis, and our honored guest, Clay Risen.
Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Clay, for coming in. Again, it's always a pleasure just to chat research with you, because you've always got something interesting. We're going to talk about some future projects down the line, but I think the question that everybody wants to know right now is, how did you get in your time machine and decide to write this book, because we all know how long it takes to do that research and writing.
You know,
why this?
You know, it's a version for any author who has a timely book. It's sort of that version of the Chinese curse. You know, may you live in interesting times. It's sort of, at least for me, it's like, may you publish a book that people want to read, but because things are going sideways in the country. No, it's a topic that I'd been interested in for a long time, and something that had come up in a lot of my previous research, particularly books and other projects I did around post-war American history. The Red Scare and anti-communism was often kind of this gray matter that shaped a lot of other things that happened during that period. And so that's really what led me to this question. I also had a very personal connection. My grandfather was a FBI agent, and he got his start during and after World War II, and he was involved in loyalty examination or investigations and checking people out. And so I grew up with some stories like that, and it was just something that I wanted to know more about. And I started the project in 2018, so which feels like a millennium ago. But you know, I will say at the time, I did have a feeling like, look, there's a lot of mutual suspicion in America. People are not getting along the way they used to. Looking back on that time now, it's just, that seems like Ozzie and Harriet compared to today. But that's what I thought. But look, I finished the book. The last edits I finished about a year ago. So I had no idea what would come, and it just played out that way.
Well, and all jokes aside, I think this is one of the themes that ran through my head as I was reading is, you have to do some hard historical work of going back and fact-checking some default American assumptions about a time that we tend to stereotype and lampoon now, but is also perennially relevant because these same tensions always exist.
Yeah, that's true. I think this is true with any work of history, particularly, let's say, American history, where people tend to see through lines. It's not that old of a country. We tend to think back to George Washington, for example, and think, well, he spoke English, he lived in Virginia. He's like, different, but I can kind of understand where he was as opposed to Charlemagne or something. But the danger there is, of course, George Washington did live a different life. it was a different world. I mean, America was a fundamentally different place, and not just because they didn't have the internet. You know, it was a slaveholding society. It was a tiny little sliver of white settlement on a giant continent that referred back as much to England as it did to America as we know it today. And so it had a fundamentally different worldview. And we can find similarities. And the closer you get to the present, the easier it is to make those connections, because then you start to get in even, like I said, family connections, right? But for even some basic things you have to keep in mind, they didn't know what was going to happen. They looked to a different past than we do. You know, I always play that game. Okay, well, I'm 49, 30 years ago for me, what was it like? I know what I think of, say, my early adulthood. What did my grandfather think of his early adulthood? These sort of games. And I think that's very useful for a writer of history or a reader of history. You really have to find a way to decenter yourself and to say, well, what was that world like? And you have to be able to have something of an imagination and a creativity, even though, of course, it all has to be grounded in fact. You can't make stuff up. But you do have to kind of draw on your understanding and a deep reading of the context to start to, you know, fill in some cracks. And that, I think, to me, that's the fun part, or one of the fun parts of writing history, but it's also really challenging. And then, you know, the other part of that is not to be presentist. I mean, the big danger with this book, but really with all books, is trying to tell a story about the past that explicitly, or even implicitly, is really about the present. And I think there's no getting away from that ultimately. You always, you know, they say, you know, history is stories that we tell ourselves about the past. And so that's always going to be true. But you have to find ways to check that as a historian and to say, okay, I'm not going to tell this story simply in a way that is packaged for some contemporary lesson. I want to make the past weird in a way. I want people to feel decentered when they read a work of history. And then from there, find their own path back to the present and hopefully come back to the present with some new ideas.
And I think that's a great framing. I often use this weirding term because I think it is so striking, but it's also exactly the right thing. So set the stage for us. Weird for us, the end of World War II in the United States.
Yeah, so I think one of the starting premises for the book is, you know, this idea that, well, I guess countering the idea that the post-war era was all Ozzie and Harriet and abundance and social conformity, and it did become that. I mean, for a lot of people, not everybody, but for a lot of people in the 1950s. But in the immediate aftermath of World War II, we're talking, you know, 46, let's say up to 49, really even into 1950 in the Korean War, people were very uncertain and unsettled. You had a couple of things going on. I mean, first of all, you take the average American average American adult in 1946, and they've been through a Great Depression. They've been through dramatic changes and dislocations because of that. Then they've been through World War, and regardless of where you were on the home front, in the military, whatever, you were affected. You probably knew people who were killed. You had family members. If you were in the military, there's a good chance if you survived, you came back with physical or emotional, psychological harms. And you returned to a country that was very afraid that things would go back to the way they were. There was a real concern that the end of the war economy would push America back into a Great Depression. In fact, Commerce Secretary Henry Wallace in 1946, before he was fired, we can go into that later, but he figures in the story subsequently. But he predicted very not presciently, but very vehemently, that depression was coming in 1946. There was a housing crisis. There simply was not enough housing for all of these soldiers who had left a lot of them had left as children, or as 18-year-olds. They had left their homes to go fight, and they came back, and they were men and women, and they were adults. And or maybe they had gotten married and then they went to war. They needed a place to live, and there wasn't anywhere. And so times were very tough. One movie that I watched when I started working on this, The Best Years of Our Lives, which is largely forgotten today, and very unfairly. I mean, it's a very good movie, and it just swept the Academy Awards. But it tells this story, and it tells a very different post-war story. And then, of course, there's the fact that we were almost immediately going into the Cold War. So having fought this war against Germany and Japan, having dropped an atomic bomb on Japan, all of this that kind of felt like, okay, now it should be over. And within a year, we're being told, no, actually, now the guys that we were friends with, or maybe not friends, but allies, we were allies with, we're now going one-on-one with them, and it may very quickly turn into World War III. And so people were incredibly scared of what was going on. And that, more than anything, set the context for what followed.
Yeah. And speaking of that, I was going to ask this a little bit later, but it transitions so well right now. China plays a really important role, not only in the international relations sphere, but a lot of the foreign service, the diplomats, the military, even folks in commerce and things like that, that are wrapped up in trying to support this nationalist government in China that then, of course, falls, are some of the first people that some scrutiny gets turned on internally.
Yeah, there was, because I think historically the United States has, been culturally connected to Europe, and because obviously the Soviet Union was placing a lot of emphasis on expanding its sphere of influence in the 40s in Europe, we tend to think of the early Cold War very much in that context. But for a lot of people, it was that and what was happening in China. And in fact, for a lot of people, even more so, there were many people who were prescient about the shifting of geopolitics, and that while the old colonial powers in Europe had long determined the scope and shape of geopolitical comings and goings, the East was going to be where it's at next, simply because of population, but also, because of very dynamic societies like Japan and others that, once they recovered from the war, would come along. And and once the colonial era moved on. And it's also, the United States in that regard was sort of a pivot, right? We were very involved in Europe, obviously, but also had a long history going back, certainly, the mid-1800s, but then really with the takeover of the Philippines and Hawaii, and our positioning ourselves as really sort of the commanders of this Pacific lake, as it were. And yeah, so there was immediately the nationalists, the anti-communist nationalists, and the communists in China under Mao Zedong broke out in a civil war. And they'd sort of been there already, but they were also busy fighting the Japanese. And so almost from the get-go, it was clear that the communists were going to win. They had the support of the people, they had a lot of the rural territory, and the nationalists held less and less ground in some of the cities. The nationalists were also, the leadership was incredibly corrupt and inefficient. The United States gave billions of dollars to the nationalists to try to prop them up, and it didn't work. And ultimately, the nationalists fell. Mao took over. The communists took over. The nationalists fled to Taiwan. And it immediately came up as a question because there were, as you said, a lot of people who supported the nationalists, politicians, diplomats, a lot of people in commerce in the United States who really didn't want to see communism in China. And they were so invested in this idea that when the nationalists fell, it seemed obvious that there had to be some sort of conspiratorial reason, that it couldn't be simply that the nationalists were the wrong people for the wrong time.
And so then returning here domestically, I think we've got to talk about President Truman first, trying to ride out a lot of these big tectonic shifts.
Yeah. So, the interesting. I think Truman has, over the years, his reputation has risen, but at the time he was seen as just a hayseed, an accidental president. He had been brought in as vice president and taken office just months before Franklin Roosevelt died. And, there were questions about his, could he fill the shoes of Franklin Roosevelt? And you're right, almost immediately he's thrown into these giant questions. Britain is one of the first ones. Britain basically came to the United States, and this is sort of one of the first scenes in the book. The British said to Truman and his advisors, we've been propping up the Greeks. The Greeks have a real problem with communist guerrillas. We're not going to do that anymore. We don't have the money. We're pulling out in 6 weeks. And Truman had to decide, well, are we going to fill that's a lot of money and a huge commitment. And are we going to do that? And obviously he just couldn't do it by himself. He had to get Congress on board. He had to get the public on board. And so very early on, he decided, yes, that's what we're going to do. We have to push back against the Soviet Union. It's very clear that the Soviets want to push as far into Europe as they can, and it's really, we're the only ones who can stop them. And so not only did he send aid to Greece and other countries, initially Turkey, but then he created the Marshall Plan, or he and George Marshall, his Secretary of State, created the Marshall Plan to pour billions more into the West. They offered it to the East, but obviously the Soviet Union wasn't going to take the money. And so it created this dividing line. And it's right around this time when Winston Churchill, who was then out of office, he traveled to, he was giving a speaking tour across the United States, and he was speaking at Westminster College in Missouri, and he gave his famous Iron Curtain speech. And he said, look, we are now in a Cold War. There's an Iron Curtain running from Stettin, in Poland, to Trieste, which is now in Italy. And everything east is communist and everything west is democratic for now. But we are going to be fighting, it's worth reading if you're interested in this period. It's a fascinating speech, and he really is very prescient about what would happen. He didn't necessarily think a war was going to break out. Rather, he kind of mapped out what a Cold War would look like and what it would require from, frankly, leaders like Truman, frankly, only leaders like Truman. The British were not going to do it. The French were not able to do it. So it was really up to us. And so Truman's strategy here is very important for setting the context. First of all, Truman was a much better president and a much smarter guy than anybody gave him credit for at the time, except for Dean Acheson, who would eventually be his Secretary of State. And Dean Acheson was this, patrician. Everyone thought he was kind of an arrogant jerk, which he probably was. But Dean Acheson is one of the few people who said, you know what, Truman is brilliant. Truman reads more than anybody else. He reads everything I give him. He is punctual. He gets everything immediately. And Truman said, look, we have to essentially build up the Soviets. We have to show Americans why the communist movement is such a threat. in order for us to justify this. Now, he was thinking internationally. The threat for him was really overseas. But he did not necessarily draw a line between domestic and foreign in that regard. And he was also under a lot of pressure to show that he was tough on communism at home. There were already rumors of Soviet espionage, Soviet subversion. And so, which he took seriously. He didn't take that seriously. I think one of the sort of mixed characteristics is one of his sort of, I don't know, it's not a wholly good asset, maybe in this context. You know, he really believed that Americans were very pragmatic, very reasonable people, that they would never, Americans weren't ideological, that they couldn't be taken over by, or taken on by a movement like communism. Remember, what he didn't see was that, you know, Americans are given to demagoguery and to conspiracy theories, right? And so he really he underestimated the risk. I mean, if you had asked him in 1947, do you think that a senator could come along and take hold of the entire American political system and with lies and half-truths and just bluster dominate the conversation and scare everybody for 4 years? He would have said, no, that's ridiculous. Americans would never go for that. Well, that's exactly what happened. So Truman, kind of to placate criticism, to show that he was tough on communism, he created a loyalty program within the federal government. And it was very badly designed, partly because it wasn't really supposed to do very much. But it ended up becoming the template for loyalty tests across state and local governments, in private industry, at universities. This idea that the government or your employer has the right to come to you and say, what are your beliefs? Who are your associates? All these things that fundamentally violate the First Amendment. And that if you didn't answer those questions, you would be investigated further, you would probably be fired, you would be blacklisted. All of these things grew out of that initial loyalty test. I don't think Truman, I mean, I know Truman, he says in his memoirs, this is a huge mistake.
And I really loved the way you open up on the first page. You focus in on a lady named Helen Reed Bryan, who in January of '46 is one of the first people to sort of get caught up in this. What does her story tell us about kind of your average person that gets caught up in these investigations?
Yeah, the reason why I just found her to be a fascinating character, and she sort of, her story bookends the book, so both at the beginning and the end. It's a very sympathetic character. The thing that jumped out for me was she was very typical of a lot of liberal progressive types. Now, she was never a communist. She wasn't especially ideological, but she was someone who, yeah, in some ways, I mean, I know I said not to do this at the beginning, but she does feel very modern in certain ways. And she grew up in a pretty well-off family. She went off to college and became interested in social issues. At the time, it was women's right to vote, civil rights. This was during World War I. It was, opposition to America entering the war. And she continued with these things. And she worked for civil rights groups. She wasn't a Quaker, but she worked with some Quaker organizations. Sort of this sort of intersection of civil rights and religion in the 20s and 30s, and ended up working for a group that helped refugees from the Spanish Civil War. And, she is, like a lot of people in the 30s who were in that world, she wasn't a communist. She didn't believe in communism, but she also understood that on a certain level, everyone's kind of working for the same thing. And this was a fact on the left in America in the 1930s. There was what was known as the Popular Front. And it was sort of an adjunct, cultural adjunct to the New Deal. And you have the New Deal is very much a Franklin Roosevelt Democratic government project, but it also opened the door to a lot of cultural changes in the country. Music and theater and literature. And everyone And there was a lot of crossover. You're a socialist, you're a liberal, you're a Democrat, you're a communist. You're not going to agree on everything, but you're going to agree on certain things. You're going to agree that fascism is bad, and you're going to help try to fight fascism in Spain or support people who are doing that, or in Germany or wherever. So Brian is in that mix. And then the Red Scare settles in, or anti-communism really takes over in 1946 with one of the first steps is sort of the making permanent the House Un-American Activities Committee. Up until then, it had been sort of this temporary provisional committee. Suddenly it had funding, it had permanence, and they went just on a tear. And the very first organization that they went after was this refugee group that she had been the executive secretary of. And they demanded she hand over their papers, all the books. She refused to do that, and she was held in contempt and went to prison for it. And she was the first person to be sent to jail. She was by far from the last. She was far from the last, and I think she becomes very typical, as you said, of not just famous people, but all sorts of people who, in her case, stood up and refused to cooperate. Other people had no recourse; they were simply dead to rights. Maybe there's proof that they had been in the Communist Party, or they had given money to a group that was a front for the Communist Party, or all these things that in the 30s were taken to be kind of just the way things worked, and suddenly, 10 years later, were targets on people's backs. And not everybody went to prison, but a lot of people lost their jobs, they lost their livelihoods. It's been interesting talking about this book, going around the country and talking to audiences. The number of people who say, my grandfather had a farm, and he couldn't get a loan to support the farm because he had been in this front organization in the 30s, or he had been a communist, or whatever, and so he lost his farm. My great-grandmother was a teacher, and she refused to talk about her political beliefs, and she was fired. And these stories just go on, and it's not a Washington story, it's not an LA story, it's a everywhere in America story.
And I find this really fascinating, thinking about Alger Hiss, for example, right? A lot of folks who had sort of traveled down these similar paths in the 30s are now confronted by former colleagues and comrades. And this is a really interesting dynamic of who's on either side of these testimony tables.
Yeah, it absolutely was. I mean, with Alger Hiss, he was accused by one of his, depending on, Alger Hiss said he had never met Whittaker Chambers. Whittaker Chambers said, oh, we definitely knew each other. We were both communists. And this became the story. I mean, there were a lot of sort of predicate stories like Helen Reed Bryan's and the Hollywood 10 was a big story. But it was really the Hiss Chambers controversy that took over, really dominated Washington, dominated the papers, and really divided the country. And I think it's a really important story. I think Alger Hiss was guilty. I think he was not just a communist, but he was a spy. I know people today who still feel otherwise. And in the book, it's actually not really important to me, or important to the book, whether he was guilty or not. What was interesting to me was the way that this trial divided the country. That you were either all in with Hiss, and you believed that there was the entire right wing, conservatives, Republicans, everyone was out, or anyone who anti-communist, they were all just out to destroy good people like Alger Hiss. They were out to destroy the New Deal. They were out to destroy everything that liberals had built. If you believed Chambers, then you believed that there were communists everywhere, or at least you were open to this idea. You didn't believe that there could be anything good to come from the other side. It really, and the possibility of both of these being true was just almost impossible for people to wrap their heads around. That Hiss could be guilty, but also that the existence of people like Hiss and of the Cold War and all of these questions was being abused by opportunists and ideologues. I think these days it's easier to understand because we have examples like McCarthy, who was not yet on the scene in 1948. We can see the buffoonery and the wickedness of that, but at the time it wasn't seen that way, and instead it was just this retreat to one of two camps in a deep partisanship that, again, I said I wouldn't do it, but it does feel, it actually, feels very much like the present, and I think it's very dangerous for this country, especially if we have media and sort of interlocutors. Today it's social media or influencers or whatever. We don't have a lot of people who are trying to, work the middle. And I don't necessarily mean that, they're moderates or not, but people who try to find nuance and say, not every story that you hear from your side is true, and not every story that people tell on the other side is wrong. You need to sit down and actually try to piece it apart. That's kind of your obligation as a citizen in a democratic society. I think that's a big problem today. I think it was a huge problem in the 1940s and early 50s.
Well, and I thought one of the more interesting points that you made is, there is a media evolution story that runs through as you move further and further through the book. As we move from a world of newspapers and radio eventually into television, people are doing interviews on Meet the Press. Yeah. And again, this gets back to the point that you made earlier. That makes it seem to us very familiar, but we also have to remember how new these technologies are, and they're still in the process of adoption and adaptation.
Yeah, one of the things that, I always find this when I write a book and then maybe I'm giving a talk or I'm thinking about what I wrote, man, I wish I'd done things a little differently. And I'm happy with the book, don't get me wrong, but I just think that there's a lot more, or there's a lot that could be underlined about this very question. And of course I should have seen this being a journalist, but it is exactly that. And there are kind of two things going on. First of all, there is the revolution in media technology, and particularly television. And in some ways, radio was transformative, but it didn't change things in the visual way that television did. And television is a fundamentally different way of conveying information. You don't need any sound at all. But of course, you get the combination of sound and image, and it just is transformative. And it took a while for people to understand what that could mean. And I think one of the really important things that Edward R. Murrow did with his expose about Joe McCarthy was not just that he was willing to stand up and say, hey, I'm going to call this guy out, and I'm going to show you why he's a demagogue. But it was that he did it with television. And up until then, most Americans had only really seen McCarthy, if they had seen him at all, they had seen a still photo of him, and often posed or, made him look good. Most people probably, they might have heard him on the radio, they would have read about him. And Murrow understood the power of this new medium to show and tell, and to expose a different vision of McCarthy. I mean, he definitely put his thumb on the scale, if anyone's ever seen it. He is not showing all sides of McCarthy. He's giving you a pretty negative view of McCarthy, but then that is the power of television. But the other thing that was going on at the time was a real conversation about what is the obligation of the media to report, particularly on people like McCarthy. So in the early 50s, and McCarthy was kind of dominated the stage from early 1950 until late-ish 1954, so a long time. And one thing that started off, at the beginning, there were kind of three camps within the media. One was, there were a lot of newspapers that were conservative, very conservative. They loved what McCarthy was doing. I mean, we think of, I certainly at one point thought of this era of being all about objective news or neutral news, to a fault, where you would never get any real opinion or any point of view in the analysis, or any analysis at all in newspapers. But it's not the case. There were places, the Chicago Tribune, for example, is very conservative, and not just in its editorial pages, but even in its coverage and the way that it would rewrite news feeds from the AP to give it a slant, to give it its slant. So they were very happy with McCarthy. And then there were people there were newspapers that were really just happy to have, this salacious news every day. And this is what McCarthy really lived off of. He knew that he had the Tribunes of the world in his pocket, but he really lived off the fact that there were all these reporters and editors who wanted nothing more than to have a great scoop every day. And McCarthy fed them, and he fed off of that. He understood that he could kind of give people unproven assertions and outright lies right before a deadline, and they would always print them before they checked. And then there's a third camp that was really, really honestly trying to grapple with this. Up until McCarthy, it was kind of taken as a given that if a politician said something in public, it made a factual claim in public, then that was a pretty ironclad source. You should be able to trust the politicians. And you might not agree with them, you might hear different things from different politicians, but that if a politician said X is Y, great. McCarthy was saying, 2 + 2 is 7. And, they knew it. They knew he was not telling the truth, and they learned very quickly his methods and whatnot, but they grappled with how to frame that. How do you call into question someone who is an elected servant of our democracy? And so there were all these debates within newsrooms, among newsrooms, white papers that would be sent around, where they really tried to deal with this. What is the right way? Because we're also, we're still trying to be objective. We're still trying to be neutral in that sense. We're not trying, we don't want to be seen as the enemies of McCarthy. McCarthy would say, oh, of course, the evil media, they're the bad guys and all this. But the media didn't see him, they may personally have seen him as a bad guy, but they wanted to present all the material. They wanted to be fair-minded. And yet, here was somebody who was very, very obviously not fair-minded. So how do you cover that? And how do you, as a newspaper, respond, especially in a country where, at one point, upwards of 60%, certainly more than half, of the American public trusted McCarthy more than anybody else. So, if McCarthy said 2 + 2 is 7, there were a huge number of people out there who were going to say, oh, I never knew that. I always thought it was 4. But now McCarthy says this, so I guess it's 7. And how do you, as a newspaper, responsibly cover that without looking like the skunk at a garden party?
Well, I know we want to have questions from the audience, so if you do have question cards, we're going to have ushers come around and collect those here shortly. But while we're getting those in, I wonder if we could talk a little bit, and you alluded to it by mentioning Hollywood, the ways that, of course, sensationally, these investigations turn on popular media, and then also start to target other vulnerable communities. We have a lavender scare that is better remembered today than it ever has been, and of course targeting civil rights organizations as well as communist adjacent. We spend a lot of time in the book with Paul Robeson, who I think sort of covers a lot of ground and is a figure to focus. Maybe you could talk a little bit about his role in this.
Yeah, so let's see where to start. I'm just going to riff for a minute. So starting with the Hollywood 10 and the blacklist, I mean, it's one of those stories that I really enjoyed this part of the book and it's sort of split into 3 different chapters over in different parts because it kind of comes and goes, has different phases. And I thought I knew the basic story. And it's not that there's some revisionist story that I was like, you thought it was this, but actually it's all this. It's just there's so much more. There's so much more material. The way the blacklist operated, I found fascinating. That it was, there was no list per se. That was illegal. There was no, collusion by the studio heads that said, okay, here's a list of people who can't work. It was just understood. There was a lot of whisper campaigns. And someone might suddenly find themselves without a job, or their contract canceled, or no one would hire them, and they would wonder. There was one anecdote, this is anonymous, unfortunately, but someone had told a reporter, or this is an actor, he said, I stopped getting work, and I was really worried, and then finally, someone took me aside and kind of whispered to me, it's because you're on the blacklist. And he said, oh, thank God. I thought it was because I was a bad actor. But there was a whole industry of people who managed the blacklist as a concept. There were lawyers who, if you found yourself on the list, they would essentially tell you what to do. How do you approach the FBI? How do you write a letter to absolve yourself? How do you get in front of HUAC? There were people who would sort of they were sort of clearance agents who, for a fee sometimes, you would write them a letter saying, God, I'm really sorry. I'm not sure what I did, but I'm sorry I did it. And please let me back into Hollywood. And sometimes they would reject it, or they would ask for edits. I found some, these are all at the library at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Boxes and boxes of these from Lena Horne, Kirk Douglas, Vincent Price, John Ford, John Houseman. It goes on, all these people who were blacklisted at one point and were trying to absolve themselves. And then there were people who were in a position to, if they thought you were being honest, they would go to the studio heads and say, look, you can bring Lena Horne back in. Speaking of Lena Horne, one of the things that she tried to use in her defense, she very much, said, look, I was very involved in the civil rights movement, and I think I went too far. And it links into this other aspect of the Red Scare, which is the way that communism became this kind of all-encompassing smear for all kinds of causes, and civil rights being one of them. So, the Communist Party, the communist movement, was in the 1930s very active in civil rights. That does not mean that everyone involved in civil rights was a communist. The NAACP was very adamantly anti-communist, always has been. And yet, suddenly, if you were someone who worked closely with the NAACP or you just worked on civil rights, you were suspect, and you would have to explain yourself. Why were you signing this petition? Why did someone see you at this march? Who were you affiliating with? It was sort of a proxy or a gateway, or honestly, just a smear. Similarly, this would be an issue if you were working in, depending on the context, but working on labor issues. If you were too pro-union, you might be called into question. Women's rights was another one. And you mentioned the lavender scare. So this is a specific case that had been forgotten for a specific story, sub-story. It had largely been forgotten for a long time. And it's this pretty astounding turn of events. In the 1930s and 40s, there was, particularly in Washington, D.C., and a little bit in other cities, but kind of because everyone was thinking about other things, but also because of this culture of the New Deal and the Popular Front and just a more tolerant, diverse America, it was starting to be possible in certain places to be kind of out of the closet, a little bit. Not open, but there were bars that were understood to be places where gay men or lesbians would gather, and it was okay. It was some people in the right context could be out to their friends. There were these sort of green shoots coming up. And then all of a sudden, after the end of World War II, there was a rapid reversal of this and a very dramatic cracking down on gay life, especially in Washington. And this intersected with the Red Scare. Starting in about, actually very specifically in early 1950, when people started to, led or initiated by McCarthy, to start to go after government officials, particularly in the State Department, who were known or suspected of being gay. And this set of arguments emerged very quickly. There were two separate sets of Senate hearings on specifically the question of homosexuals in the government and the national security implications of that. And the first CIA director had a list, 10 bullet points of why gay men and women were a national security threat. And they were things like they can be blackmailed, they're in the closet, so they're lying, so they're liars, so why can we trust them? You know, a general kind of moral opprobrium, gay men all hang out together, so they're this secret cabal. Anyway, all this stuff. And it was just taken as writ that of course that's true, right? All those things are true. And so hundreds of gay men and women, it was really focused on gay men, were summarily fired, mostly from the State Department, although these files are all at the National Archives. Every government agency had to do its own sweep, and down to things like, so there's a report from the Smithsonian where the head of the Smithsonian, or one of the heads, filed a whole report. It's like, okay, I went through every person and here's what I found. The National Monuments Commission, like really obscure, but everybody had to do this. That's the extent of the fear that, to some extent, like you read through this and you go through enough of the material, like, this isn't really about national security, is it? Right? There's like a point where you realize, oh, this is just blatant homophobia, using the pretext of the Red Scare and the Cold War to lash out at gay men and women. And that's, I think that's it's both an important story in itself, but it's also indicative of the time and the willingness of people to take advantage of a really scary moment in America to their own bigoted ends.
Again, I'll want to come back to Paul Robeson, because I thought,
oh yeah, right.
Particularly,
Sorry,
but especially, he's this bridge, particularly through Peekskill, that connects us down to the ways that this sort of popular culture of the Red Scare, in the same ways maybe that a New Deal culture of the Popular Front gets sort of distilled down into everyday America. We see those kind of these violent protests and
yeah. So Paul Robeson was a famous singer and performer. I'll say that I should preface this. Paul Robeson, he said some pretty dumb things in his life. I respect him a lot. He was a great performer, very brave man. He was very naive about communism, very naive about the Soviet Union, very angry about the United States, for good reason. He was really faced was on sort of the receiving end of some pretty ugly racism, specifically in his life. And, so all of that is just sort of pretext. He was never a member of the party. He was just sort of admired communists. But you mentioned Peekskill, and this is a moment in 1949. There's a concert in Peekskill, New York, which is in Westchester. It's a pretty nice off suburb north of New York City. And there was a concert to benefit a group of Communist Party leaders who were on trial in the city. And Paul Robeson was there, and Pete Seeger was there. Hundreds of people went up there, showed up, and they wwere immediately attacked by locals. I mean, largely. Some people came from out of town, but these were VFW members, American Legion members, and then just other people who sort of came on. And, they were, the bulk of it was, we hate communists, we're in there. But what was, I think, really, and that's, terrible in itself, you're just attacking people physically for your beliefs. But mixed in there was a really heavy dose of racism. This is Westchester County, New York, and people were burning crosses and, saying all sorts of really terrible things. And also, there were, a good number of Jews there. There was a lot of people from the garment industry, which was heavily Jewish. They were up there as well. So there's a lot of anti-Semitism. Really, I don't have to go into it, but, and there were reporters who took all this down. And so the first concert didn't work. The second concert did, but then there was another violent encounter there. No one was killed, but a lot of people were injured, sent to the hospital. It was a pretty ugly moment. And, what I think it demonstrated again is this conflation of anti-communism, which is its own thing. And I think there is a legit, I don't mean to say that everyone's anti-communist is bad. I think there's I'm not in favor of communism, but that, certainly an extreme version is not, it's not a healthy thing. But the way that it was conflated with anti-Semitism, with white supremacy and racism, with misogyny, these things all sort of mixed together. And Robeson's story, I think, was really helpful to kind of piece apart some of those things. Because Robeson himself saw, in a way that, for the third or fourth time, I will say, actually feels pretty modern. Because Robeson was, very, had his own kind of radical take. I mean, he believed that, America really had, its fundamental sin was racism, that America had a lot to atone for. You read the things that he said, and they really sound like a Black Lives Matter activist. But that's where he was coming from. And yet, because he himself was very much a product of these intermixing of different ideas and different strands on the left, he faced a lot of attacks from different directions. He's a fascinating character, and he was broken by this experience. People will, at the time, people noticed. He was ostracized by his friends. He was really pushed aside, and physically, he was a big guy. Physically, just by the end of the 50s, was worn down.
So in our national memory, the fever breaks, and this hysteria dissipates. How does that line up with what you found when you actually looked?
So I think, in part, it did happen. I mean, it's one of the, silver linings of witch hunts and hysterias is they do tend to break like fevers. And it's not ahistorical. There's a reason why people sort of moved on from this. And it's because by the mid-1950s, we were a prosperous, abundant, self-satisfied country. We didn't have as much to be afraid of. Joseph Stalin was dead. The Korean War was over. It was pretty clear that the US and the Soviet Union would more or less coexist in these spheres. Obviously, the Cuban Missile Crisis and other things were still in the future, but at the time it sort of seemed like, okay, we're gonna fight kind of on the edges, but we are gonna avoid a war, right? It also was just increasingly clear that there really weren't any communists. I mean, even by the beginning of the Red Scare, the Communist Party was falling apart. In this regard, Truman was absolutely correct. The Communist Party just didn't have a purchase on the American mind. It doesn't work in this country. And, yes, there are people who adopt that ideology, but it's not something that most people are going to go for. And the party was just sort of doomed from the beginning. And, so, I mean, there's a joke that by the end, by 1950, the Daily Worker, that was the newspaper that the communists published, that it was the only reason it survived was because most of its subscribers were FBI agents who were, wanted to go through and see what was, or local police, which is probably not untrue. I mean, but anyway, so, people kind of realized that there's nothing there. HUAC, couldn't find any more people to go after. So there's that. There's also the fact that guys like Edward R. Murrow and a number of politicians in Congress finally stood up and started and took on McCarthy. And with McCarthy being this kind of, not the be-all and end-all of the Red Scare, but certainly the symbol, the figure who really who embodied it. When he fell, that kind of took the notch under, took the feet from under it. But I actually think it was very important what happened in the courts as well, because the Red Scare worked because there were all these laws that existed or were created during this period that were incredibly invasive, were clear violations of people's freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom from self-incrimination. It was a very hard time for civil liberties. And for a long time, the courts up to the Supreme Court went along with it. And it was only when Earl Warren came to the court as Chief Justice in 1953 that he started to, first of all, he himself kind of set aside his previous allegiance to kind of law and order deference to law and order and deference to the police and the FBI that he had long sort of held dear. And he became the civil liberties champion that we know today. And we know him from Brown versus Board of Education, desegregating schools. We know him from the Miranda decision. We know him from Gideon versus Wainwright, these very important civil liberties decisions. But he drove a truck through this infrastructure that held up the Red Scare. Case after case after case, he built majorities that either trimmed down or got rid of entirely these laws and capabilities, or assumed capabilities of Congress and the FBI to invade people's private lives. And by 1957, he had largely succeeded. And I think that's really important, because even though the fever had broken, there was still this infrastructure, and it had to be taken apart, because the real risk was that, well, things could just go south again. And I would say one thing that I try to end the book with is just, and this does sort of point to the future. A lot of people at the time who were around McCarthy, I guess we'd call them McCarthyites, they saw him as a martyr. And there was when he kind of fell from grace and died a few years later, he still had 30% of the country behind him. And these were people who, particularly the hardcore, really believed that he had been sacrificed, or he was a martyr, and had been killed by this sort of cabal, this conspiracy that existed in the highest levels of government and media and in the business world, that there was this sort of elite conspiracy. And I mean, it's outside the scope of the book, but I do think that has a genealogy down to the present, whether you look at individual people and the influences that their thinking had on subsequent generations, but also just this idea that at the heart of everything that's wrong with American society is this specific conspiracy. And obviously, conspiracy theories come and go in their specifics, but there's always that idea. And sometimes they're very popular, sometimes they seem to really sort of bubble up, and other times they're sort of quiescent down in the corners. But I'd say now they're, in the last several years, they've been kind of really shaped our political thinking, at least for some people. And I think that's one of the lasting sort of stories and legacies of the Red Scare, is just this the kind of permanence of this idea that everything can be explained by this theory, this conspiracy, this idea that there are these men in dark corners who are controlling everything we do. And this isn't, the Red Scare is not the first time that happened, right? I mean, witch hunts and hysterias have a long history in America, but this idea, very centered on the government and very centered on a particular capacity of government, is something that took root then, and I don't think we've ever gotten rid of.
Absolutely. Do we have any questions from the audience? And we'll try to be, I guess, relatively rapid fire here.
Yes.
What was the impetus for the popular program I Led 3 Lives?
Yes. So this is a story, a true story, about a fellow who was an undercover. He was a member of the Communist Party, and he was sort of underground, right? So there are people who didn't know he was a communist. And then he became an informer for the FBI. So he sort of led 3 lives. And there were a number of people who became celebrities. And, you know, and some, I mean, I think a lot of people who are sort of ex-communists, right? And I think a lot, you know, there were many of them who were very honest. I think Whittaker Chambers is one who, you know, really examined his beliefs and came to really detest communism. And I think Chambers is kind of a tragic figure because he didn't really ask for this. It sort of fell on him to become this spokesman for the evils of communism. But there were others who really made a career out of it. And they published books, they became professional witnesses, they went on lecture tours. There was a cottage industry where you would go around and you would talk about the horrors of the Communist Party. And, you know, like, look, I mean, there's a place for that. I think it was, I think there's certainly something healthy about that. That said, there were others who really embellished, and too many, who embellished what they were saying. This case was true. I mean, that one may be sensationalized, but it's true. But there were others. There was a guy, Harvey Matusow, who was an ex-communist, who testified to all kinds of crazy things that it was kind of obvious he couldn't have possibly known, but he was brought in as an expert witness in trials. He testified. He ended up going to jail because he was lying the whole time, but people believed him.
Do you have any more coming in? I saw our ushers were moving up and down. There we come. Took the long way around.
Nope.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Oh.
if any ask if there's anything about dance, I do not dance. So you just skip right past those.
A question about, well, we were trying to avoid political news, but talking about media changes, what happens if McCarthy has access to podcasts?
Yeah, then it's a whole different ballgame. I mean, I think that's look, I mean, you know, it's always tough to draw parallels, and I try to stay away as much as possible as a historian. But, you know, one of the things that made McCarthy possible was radio and TV, well, not so much TV, but radio and newspapers, and he was a unfailingly energetic speaker. And, you know, this isn't podcasts, but he stumped so much. He went on tour all across. He spoke constantly. And, you know, in a way, I mean, it's not podcasts, but he was getting his voice out in a way that no other senator had done for a while. He really understood the power of the stump speech. Even when he wasn't running for office, he would just go out into the country and give his opinion. So, you know, if he had a podcast, he wouldn't have to do that. He would just sit in his office.
Well, and we've got a number of questions here that all are driving towards these themes of contemporary relevance, which again, we could be here all night. A very interesting one that I would like to conclude on, just for curiosity's sake. Let's turn the lens backwards in time instead of forward. And you point out in a prologue or an introduction of some point that we tend to forget that there was a first Red Scare that preceded this one. We touched on it very briefly early on, but what are the lessons of sort of both of these combined together, perhaps?
Yeah, that was something I struggled with the framing of the book, or even the title, because and now I would find this when I would talk about, as I was working on the project, if I said, I'm working on a book about the Red Scare, inevitably someone would say, oh, which one, the first one or the second one? Okay. But then if I said, well, I'm working on a book about the second Red Scare, inevitably someone would say, wait, there were two? So there was not a win, there was no win in there. But the first Red Scare, briefly, was a period right after World War I, for about a year or two, where anti-radicalism sort of took hold in the country. There had been a lot of radical activity in the 10s or the 1900s and the 1910s. And there's a real fear after World War I, having seen the fall of Russia, the rise of the Soviet Union, you know, that immigrants from Eastern Europe in particular, or Southern Europe, would bring that kind of radical activism and violent activism to the United States. And so the proto-FBI, the radical division of the Bureau of Investigation, which J. Edgar Hoover ran, was sort of tasked with cracking down on these radicals. And people at the time, it was really seen as an immigrant issue. And people were rounded up, and hundreds of people were deported. Probably more would have been deported had it not been for a group of people who kind of stepped in to help stop it. But what it did was it sort of set up this grounds for going after radicalism. And in the same way I talked about Warren kind of deconstructing the system, no one did that after the first Red Scare. So there's this sort of structure set up within the Department of Justice and at the state and local level where you know, they basically said, we're just going to keep our eye on what's going on. And it made the second Red Scare much easier. And I think in terms of what both of them indicate is that, you know, this neither is unique, right? These things happened. You could see them as part of the same story or separate stories. I think, you know, in some ways it's valuable to think of them as separate stories because it reminds us that this kind of hysteria, anti-radical hysteria in the United States is quite common. And it, you know, you could say, well, look, it, you know, happened to some extent in the 1960s or the late 1960s. You know, it comes and goes, and part of it is for deep socio-cultural reasons. Part of it's because of opportunism.
Well, thank you all for coming out tonight, and could we have a round of applause for Clay?
Thank you.